like to welcome and introduce just briefly Ivan. We have Ivan here. He's a collaborator, just published a great book with Anne-Françoise Schmid, and he will be participating with us, and also will give a concrete project. Talk about his perspective of what we proposed as our course late in the next couple sessions. So he'll be here. I'm glad he's here. So thank you for coming. And
yes, thank you, Ivo.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll bio you. We'll give your whole full bio when you present. But just wanted to say thanks.
Yeah.
So on Drive Google, you have in the discussion the link to see the fictions of Brin and of Zine, and to have the other courses.
Mm-hmm.
Where is that link?
In the discussion now.
I don't see it.
Drive Google, come Drive.
I'm going to share it. Ivan, can you post in the chat your email, and I'll share the folder.
Yeah, please.
Since we're talking about that really quickly, let me just do some quick updates about that. 1 second.
Made fiction as the fiction of Poincaré on geometry. Very, very, very nice. And Zine, a very good too fiction on distance and literary space and philosophical space. Very, very interesting.
So just some, talking, I posted now a folder for the matrix. So if you wanted to put, if you have one on that you can post there. This is going to be what we'll work with today. This is starting with her matrix, but we can, post other ones without them connecting. We can connect the relationships. Also, really just a quick thing inside of readings. Now I have requested documents. So there's for the question on utopia. This is the book that is the book form on the topic.
Yes.
So if we have any requested documents, I'll start dropping them here, or if we want to have a specific reading. And I want to point this out one more time, is that we have a glossary, and I think what we might want to start, I added just some quick notes, but what we're gonna want to start doing is start to take our concepts of maybe just the abstract or the concrete and start to flesh this out collectively to see if we can start to have an idea. It's a good point as well, halfway through this, where we stand. So because we're really going to want to accelerate the work together, in the next few sessions, instead of less of hearing us talk in long form. Yeah, with that, this will be this course, this seminar, we're kind of based on the theory, on the idea of models. There's a specific historical, I'm sure we'll talk about, and Anne-Françoise will talk about it as well. There's a historical consequence of model-based reasoning taking over theory in the Western history of science, probably. But I'll pass it over to Anne-Françoise to begin.
I will begin with the introduction of models and modeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
I think we're
Yeah. Very good, very good. Yes, we have seen that one of the resistances to climate change is the mistrust of models. they must disappear in the final result. Even those who practice the models may have resistance. The reason is that models have almost always been designed as intermediaries and not for themselves. So much so that work on models has been primarily disciplinary studies. What are models in physics, geometry, biology, etc., and not properly epistemologic studies. You see the book, the model as mediator in physics, and it is an idea that is very current on the models. In America, the first and most important works on models other than disciplinary ones were sociological. See Peter Gallison, very remarkable. In France, the question of the status of models have given rise to real wars. Those who, like Alain Badiou, dans le concept de modèle, saw models only as true interpretations of theories, and called ideologists those who interpreted them otherwise as abstraction or generalization of reality. See the presentation of Joevenn. This Badiou denied the scientific character of the works of Claude Lévi-Strauss, who interpreted the models from a structural analysis of the reality. In 2007, Badiou says that there is nothing to change in his book, whereas the science work in very continuous way through models. The problem is we do not consider the autonomy of models. They are not only dependent from theory or from reality. Let's admit that they have a form of autonomy. This allows us to stop opposing these two conceptions of model. This allows another liberation of models. As scholars, Jean-Marie Leguet in biology, Jean Gogel in earth sciences, have rightly pointed out they are not representations. The models of the earth are not its representation. The models are often based on contradictory hypotheses, the earth in heat, the earth in cold, and the model itself does not allow to choose. For Leguet, saying models as representations does not allow them to be combined. The growth of a plant with its embryology, its nutrition, its exposure to the sun, its environment will not be possible as a combination of representations without internal contradiction in the modeling, it is in the articulation of different models. I think it's very important to insist on this because we currently see models as representations. It is more subtle. Henri Poincaré gave an interpretation of the model in his scientific work. Not so in philosophical work, in scientific work. In thermodynamics, for example, he shows that if we have a mechanical model, Voilà. If we have a mechanical model for a thermodynamic phenomenon, then we have an infinity of others. If we believe that we have the only one, or even the best model, we run the risk of creating a false theory, as Poincaré and Richard Feynman too, in his mechanics, have shown. The model is on the side of semantics, not of syntax. The logician will say, Sao Paulo is a big city, only and only if the geographer says Sao Paulo is a big city. And then it's up the geographer to get used to it. Sometimes a theory is considered to be incomplete and is called a model. In particle physics, this is called the standard model. But this is a particular use of the word model, which does not mean that we have an infinity of standard models, even in parallel worlds. As autonomous and multiple, the models are concrete. They are the left encounter of heterogeneous elements. And we have to know that other links and other terms are possible. Multiplicity, autonomy, concretude. So in epistemology, we talk on the models. See l'âge de l'épistémologie. Now, I give the talk to Tony, who had informatics and engineering, and he will show to us very concretely how the models work, adding abduction and new methods. So, Tony.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. But let's first, I want to step back and just ask for any kind of respondents, or if you have any response or anything. Or if you prefer that we just kind of talk through everything. I prefer the discussion base, so if you want to just, any period that you want to chime in, you can. Otherwise, we can continue, or we can do call based. But any initial thoughts about this? No? From the way she's presenting it, just clear introduction.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of clarify a point just right at the end there. The sort of models as concrete, is that like only insofar as we think of them as autonomous, as opposed to sort of something that's tied to a discipline specifically?
I think the concrete lies in the autonomy. To consider the model in other way as intermediaries. And so we have a concrete material as a body of science and a body of philosophy. Laruelle, who developed the idea of model in philosophy, talks as philosophy as a body. And Alice Lucy Recab will develop this idea in a talk on materials, body, and serpentine lines.
I'd be interested to hear a bit more about philosophy as a body, what that characterization is kind of hinting at.
Joevenn, can you resume the idea of Sein, please?
Can you say that again?
Can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, just Anne-Françoise mentioned the idea of philosophy as being a body, is something that Laurel had theorized. I'd just be interested to hear more about what that kind of description as a body is kind of hinting at or trying to theorize.
Yes. Laruelle does not consider philosophy as a sort of mathematics. And he will construct a theory of philosophy with another discipline very, very different. The more different as philosophy. And he chose physical theory who does not intervene in natural objects, but in states and equations and operators. So, the idea of body is to another line of think from Maine de Biran and Michel Henry. He respects very, very Michel Henry to have developed an idea of immanence who is very important, very new in the philosophy. But Laruelle interprets it not with the visual possibilities, but with respiration. The first movement in Laruelle is the respiration. So we understand music, the role of music. And visual art who are the first in classical philosophy, with the cavern, with the light, with etc., is transformed as a consequence of respiration. So, as a body, as a material, the philosophy, the classical philosophy, are transformed as materials for the invention of philosophy. So the idea of body is very important. Body is material. Body is not only mathematical. So the discussion between, for example, between Badiou and Laruelle is what is the importance, relative importance of mathematics or physics for philosophy. And Laruelle shows physics. But mathematics is not excused. For the immanence by Laruelle is explained by algebra. Idempotence. A plus A equal A. So there is an importance of algebra, and I think in quantum mechanics, algebra is very important, more than analysis. Very important. If you don't now algebra, it's very difficult to to have some knowledge on quanta. I have mathematics in Switzerland where algebra is very well developed. And after I had a course in Paris on quanta, and the students knew analysis, but not algebra. So the course on quanta was very difficult for them. So there is quanta and algebra, who were very, very important for La Ruelle.
And as a addendum, maybe, I mean, it's for La Ruelle, it's not even just those two, it's the formalism embedded in the practice, right? That is like that interests him continuously. I mean, he finds it's the way of making a sort of mathematical formula of experience in a way, or like from a scientific perspective on that experience, giving it formalization. This is something that he talks about in the mysticism works in the early times. That it's like the early mystics, the technology that they invented was this sort of like formalism of the world, and he took that as a way of he took that as a way of kind of as a way of kind of practicing contemporary philosophy. So you can see how these sort of things become models, not like tools to kind of auto reflect itself. It's not, you don't take a model in order to auto reflect a philosophical theory. Rather, the model is a technology that you can, in almost the way that early engineers would, like it's like an applied new technology to rethink positions that philosophy couldn't think or hasn't thought of. Yeah.
Would you say that Laura's use of algebra or interest in algebra as a formalism is, I guess, what could be seen as overly reductive or simple is kind of released from that because models aren't being seen as representative or representational, so you're not you can kind of experiment with formalism without it being reduction. Is that part of his kind of his acceptance of algebra or his interest in algebra?
I'm just going to type it out for her to read, just because when the questions get longer, they're easier to be summarized. So so you're asking, like, is the interest in the algebra, like,
is Laurel's interest in algebra, or is Laurel's ability to use algebra generatively because he rejects models as being representational? Is that part of the kind of, the reason he's able to approach algebra in this way?
Joevenn, can you resume, please?
something like this. I'm not completely.
I think that's about right.
So in the fact that models or in the fact that, yeah, thank you. Oh, okay, there's a lot of okay. mostly in in the fact that
Yes.
formalism is not reductive
Yes.
as well.
It was very important for the works on Laruelle on ecology. He thinks that that the currently ecology is more naive because we have to reconstruct the relationship between subjects, other and the current ecology, and we have to construct a formalism with new dimensions and to construct them with the collaboration from philosophy and sciences with different stage.
Zane?
Sorry, I was just typing that. But yeah, I think
No
that that example of ecology is useful. Yeah, thank you.
So yeah, so I mean the general challenge here that he takes is to build a model that sort of can extracts the theory rather than auto represents it, I guess. But it's in a reductive way. Joevenn, do you have anything that you would like to make a comment about before I go and move?
I'm good.
Good. You can hear now, by the way. You're good, obviously. So quickly, I just want to make actually, as I was preparing this week, I went back and I was reading a little bit about or some of the things that Anne-Françoise Schmid wrote, and I put them in the supplementaries, but I'm actually going to kind of mention one of them specifically, which is the question of common sense in the epistemology of theories and the epistemology of models. And I just kind of pulled some of my favorite parts of it. I really quickly want to review that before I go into mine. So 1 second. Sorry, I'm trying to share the actual part of it. As I'm pulling this up, have you both read the Magnani text or looked at it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
cool.
we have.
Good. So we'll definitely discuss that, but where did I save these?
Ludovico Magnani.
Yes. Apology. And okay, so I found that in the text, I just pulled some very quick sections of this that I kind of want to review and go over because I didn't really assign it. But this is from Anne-Françoise's work. It's from the text. It's from the question of common sense, epistemology of theories, and the epistemology of models, posted in the drive. So I found that this quote is my favorite. Yeah, right. So, which is like an interesting, like it's just an interesting sort of historical moment when the introduction of the computer, right, and how it kind of the problem with the problem before computation or the computer in general was like the ability the ability to sort of collate all of partial models in or contradictory models at once with the computer, or kind of given that practical advantage. It kind of is like a good turning point, right? So in this here, she writes here, we postulate that there are other ways of addressing the sciences which enable the classical concepts of epistemology to be put to new use. The real problem lies in providing a more minimal characterization than that provided by an epistemology of theory, which requires many elements, including an entire hypothetical deductive structure, as well as the means, which is the model, the experience, and the measurement that allow them to be put into the relation to the real. So how are we going to be proposing hypothesis for such a minimal characterization? The question can be addressed in at least two ways. And she says, based on the fashion of false theories, falsifying, right? That's the classical proof, like being able to prove is really to, find it, to be able to prove a false theory. And on the other hand, we can deepen these fields and including the engineering sciences, modeling, complexity, interdisciplinary. That is precisely the fields which presenting as obstacles. I mean, I think we talk about Lauro a lot, but the clarity of these ideas come in and Anne-Françoise work, I think. Because this is a very nice way to kind of put it. And I think the idea of common sense brought into the text is very important. And just from this section, I just want to say here, like, because she did mention this as sort of like because she was doing an introduction, and I feel she kind of mentioned these in her talk, right? So, but at the time, models were considered to be tools at the service of theory, right? And were only understood on its basis, despite the fact that models had already been constructed in fluid mechanics. Models are conceived as particularizations of the idea and logic known as true interpretation. And I'll skip the French debate. She discussed that already. So the usage of a concept of the model as a tool subordinate to theory was part of the understanding of epistemology as a progressive extension of scientific criteria to domains further and further afield of mechanics. But a limit had been reached, for numerous models emerged in this view of science that no longer responded to these criteria, and it was necessary for to be able to account for them. And because I mean, when I read this, a lot of the things I wanted to say, obviously, I think come from these quotes that I will kind of turn back to. And then I just want to read this last part here, because she discusses these two kind of pathways of communicating or kind of like distributing the knowledge, which I find really interesting: the popularizer and the provider, right? And these two kind of archetypes play an interesting perspective on where we are with or where we can be, where how I'm approaching models. So if the popularizer kind of just tries to make everything popular culture in a sort of general way, right? The approach is always that the theory is too complex, too inaccessible for common sense, whereas the provider, right, kind of provides the information in a way that is complex, that is like contradictory, and kind of relies on an agent of interpretation in this way. That there's this is like the way the internet has kind of happened, right? And And I find the positioning here interesting. While the former lodges itself in between the positive and the speculative, the latter seeks a positive and interchangeable translations for all types of scientific reasoning. This later approach also represents a generalized and profoundly transformed positivism, since it's no longer determined in opposition to the speculative, but rather in terms of the distinction between the virtual and the real. Right, and this has impact, and I bring these two last quotes up because it kind of goes back to our conversations on the fiction and the virtual. But this this relative independence on the theoretical contents has no bearing on the importance of that the notion of fiction has taken on in science, a notion that can be interpreted in a similar fashion to modeling. Not only are sciences then viewed as constructions, but also fictions. And this is something that Bryn literally said to, she literally brought up already as a, when I brought up what I wanted to kind of talk about earlier on. In this shift, we mark from a subtle passage from the virtual, or from the positive to the virtual. So if modeling no longer depends on theory, each function is in relative autonomy from one another. The engineer no longer needs to be looked on as one who merely applies theory, whereas the interdisciplinary no longer needs to be viewed as simply the result of sort of combination of theoretical perspectives, which we know that a lot of this interdisciplinary work kind of works in this way, and there's sort of like the new reading. So, I mean, because I did cite the Magnani text, I wanted to kind of provide this part of her work in her words, to kind of bring her into the conversation with this Magnani text, and so there are a lot of versions where he's kind of reiterating how this sort of works, but I wanted to ask you in this kind of framing of modeling, and knowing and thinking of how we use fictions in the past and the Matrix, like when you read this text, did you feel it was like contradictory? There's the theoretical abductions, I'm specifically curious about the manipulative abduction and the position to modeling. I'm just curious about your thoughts on Magnani's text in tension with what we've been talking about. And if you don't, I just continue. But. No. So let me bring up this text here.
Common sense is a fixed concrete, but modeling is a moving concrete.
What is the fixed concrete?
The fixed concrete is that when we act in quotidian life, we have a lot of heterogeneous things that we admit as they exist. So we cannot act in a world where all is moving. The common sense admit implicitly that they are fixed things. But when we create models, create in philosophy, in music, etc., in art, in plastic art, in science too, the real is no more only fixed, is in movement, and this movement can create new ways between the different disciplines. Modeling is too an art.
Mm.
Yeah, there's a bit in the text where he describes like visual perception as a form of visual abduction. I think his point is similar to that, as what Anne-Françoise said about the common sense, in that you know, there's a kind of we kind of reach for patterns that we're already familiar with, but it's kind of like a rapid it's a rapid kind of way of falsifying what we're seeing that creates order and makes the strange kind of seem normal and more ordered. So so that I thought it was interesting presenting perception as that kind of like rapid form of abduction, implying that perception could also kind of if you, I'm not sure how to say this exactly, but basically you could take the same perception and it could become a model, whereas when you're operating on that kind of common sense paradigm or whatever, you're naturally accepting things that you wouldn't accept in modeling scenarios. Or
okay, so yeah, this is
Joevenn, can you resume, please?
Yeah, can you? It's not it's a comment, but not a question. But can you comment, and I'll make a response as well.
Yeah.
While Joevenn's summarizing, it's interesting because of two things. Well, being abducted would be kind of visual kind of processing in the way he's talking. Magnani's talking about it. Is interesting in the practical. I want to just go back though in that sense that the concept of abduction kind of first brought to the fore by Peirce, and like in the sorry, can you, Zane, can you say the last phrase that you said really quickly? Sorry, because I got, you were talking about, I apologize.
I think it was something like perception as a form of visual abduction, where you reach for previously stored thing inferences.
Magnani's perceptive abduction is visual processing and modeling, contrary to the more model-based notion. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, there is like there is the idea of like when you place common sense in the context of the Peircean model, right? And Peirce was talking about abduction when in the sense that like common sense for him is to play in this is exactly what you were saying, that you kind of like ignore certain, you kind of limit or ignore the same thing that visual perception does, is like in its subtractive qualities. But like for him, abduction was like literally like getting tripped up from that if common sense is this is a nice walk down the street, like being abducted is sort of like being tripped up out of that, and you get pulled out of that mode where you can sort of take on this role of what Magnani talks about as like theoretical abduction, which is model based, but the one that's the most interesting for him is this manipulative one. So the idea that like what kinds of concrete manipulative practices, even that you can, he does, so even with concrete manipulative practices, as well as abstract ones, like when he talks about diagrams and how visual visual perception focuses on geometry and so anyways, I don't know why, but the silence is getting me today.
I will add some.
Yeah,
I will
can I
add.
type up what I'm saying here? What will be easier is if I just bring up just to review it, I'll bring up the text itself and I can point to what I'm talking about. Because I can't stop to talk as well. Here. And yeah, okay. So model-based manipulative abduction in science. So what I was talking about is this idea of that he was proposing in this diagram of what theoretical abduction is, which is like both model-based and sentiental, right? And he talks about and we have, but creative and selective abduction. So in the way that we're talking with the selective, with selective abduction, we're talking more about the idea of how the processes between this infinite or a bunch of information to selective visual perception. But there is this idea of this creative abduction, which takes on the form of this, which is kind of integrated from selective, but we can actually manipulate it. So I want to just come down to showing. Template. Sorry. So this is really what I think is where of the text where I think we get most into what Anne-Françoise is talking about when she's talking about models, or sort of this like intermediary role or this sort of translation role, right? He discusses this concept called epistemic mediators. So the model, the model of this abductive reasoning, we can take specifically external things, manipulate them in order to then hypothesize about the world, to know more about the world, to learn more about the world. And so this is like where I kind of find a lot of stuff to be interesting. And so the just a quick review for those who might not have read it, right? The things that are formed, not all of them, these are some forms of epistemic mediators, right? Which is in order to kind of take a complex, a complex problem, simplify it, in order to like fill information, right? Or to deal with inconsistent or incommensurable things. That right there, that there's what I think we're kind of building. I think the integrative object is an epistemic mediator in that sense, as a way of kind of controlling information, controlling sense data. We know that as like external tools that we build, right, in order to kind of like navigation being the biggest, the biggest kind of one with computation, to build external models right? And to kind of discuss natural objects or phenomena, sense data. And so I wanted to kind of point to this last part on the of his conclusion as well. For me, is some research in the area of artificial intelligence has shown that the methods for discovery could be found that are computationally adequate for abductively rediscovering empirical or theoretical laws. So, however, non-standard logic has shown how we can provide rigorous formal models of many kinds of abductive reasoning, such as ones involved in defeasible, heterogeneous, and uncertain inferences. And abduction is also useful in describing different roles played by various kinds of medical reasoning to find diagnoses. And finally, here's the concrete manipulations of external objects influence the generation of hypothesis, what I call manipulative abduction, shows how we can find methods of constructivity in scientific and everyday reasoning based on external models and epistemic mediators. And I think, so I kind of, I mean, for me, it's, these are very, it's a very interesting kind of take on abduction, but to me is also when I'm reading these parts, when I'm reading these parts of the summary, I find a lot of the relationships between what we're trying to discuss in our work here, and what and it seems to be a kind of, yeah, it seems to be in relation to what we're sort of building. And so 1 o'clock. So the one thing I wanted to, the one thing I was like, the thing that these have influenced my work here is that, like, I wanted to last time we were teaching, I wanted to I'll bring it up. It was during pandemic. It was very, stop this, share for a second, screen share. Here. Do you see this new normal thing? Yeah. So I was trying to talk about the pandemic as the, like, or pandemic models as a way of constructing common, like a source of common. And I thought of I thought of the idea of building a role-playing game, something like constructing a sort of game. And I wanted to just mention this because I posted it on the drive. If you're interested in reading, it kind of follows a lot of the it kind of follows a lot of the work that led up to what we're discussing. But so I don't know, I would ask, does anybody have any problems with the text or different parts of the text that they found interesting, relatable, not relatable? No.
Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, you're quiet, but we can hear you.
Can I hear anybody? Bryn, did you say something on like from the mic? Yeah. I can't hear anybody, apparently. Hello?
Hold on.
I can hear, okay, I can hear everybody now.
Okay.
It was
I have a
my
question
fault.
to ask. So, what? I read a little bit of the article and I'm interested in. My question is, what specifically do you see? The role of manipulative. First of all, yeah, what exactly do you see of the role of abduction in your work, and secondly, of manipulative abduction? I feel like it hasn't been elaborated. I was wondering
Okay.
if you could.
Yeah, no, it's fair. My own perspective has not been said. I was hoping for a question about. All right, so
Not even about
like,
like your own perspective, but your own perspective given
no, yeah.
the readings that you've given us.
No, I mean, for me, it's there's an interest in how like my interest has always been sort of like creative sort of application to technological objects, I guess. So without going, so for like a example, like a machine learning model, which is a statistical model that can do prediction very well, for instance, and but and I can, I can, what are the sort of creative entrances into kind of exploring this thing as an epistemological object, as a contemporary object that because these things are, because then I can expand and talk about the sort of like larger themes, because I get critiqued every time if I talk about this, and if I talk about machine learning and I don't mention that they're politically motivated, I get yelled at every time or somebody posts a comment about it. Just happened. But no, so I started to get interested in this idea of abduction and using it sort of as like a stepping stone into kind of trying to actually interact with these models. One thing I like that I'm trying to work with these generative models, if I can, I guess, show it's running right now. So with these generative models, here's one that's kind of doing visual representation based on textual prompts. And so these are an ensemble of two models, two standard models. One, the one model that all it wants to know is the relationship between text and image, and it can basically can give you a good a decent general representation of what an image should look like, right? But the thing that gets, and then there's a generative application that can basically take it takes a vector space, a vector, and basically that, and it can generate an image from that. Let's just assume it can learn images and generate images. So when these two things are actually put together in this art, in this is VQGAN, should meant, there I'll post the people who have kind of invented this method. But what it does is it pits them against each other. And so what I can do is I can give it a text, and by basically changing the way that it sees the image, it's constantly optimizing, it optimizes that those sort of pixels for that given text, right? But how do you get it to kind of, or how do you know the kind of various things that these models kind of know? You start to like engineer prompts in very interesting ways. You can find like gender bias in a prompt, right, by kind of prompting it a certain way. So like in a practical way, this is the manipulating the pre-trained model with, so manipulating it without retraining it, you kind of I can manipulate it given certain keywords. I can change the artistic quality of the style of it given like based on a general word, but I mean, what's interesting about the abducting part is that you kind of, the way that there is no theory to this, it is just kind of like prompting it constantly to produce different kinds of images and see which ones work well. And when those ones work well, you kind of can base it on that. There's no theory to what is the best way to do it, right? So I'm trying to generate, this is Uncanny Valley. And I've been generating different ways of kind of prompting it Uncanny Valley to see what different kinds of images it can do. And then so the abducting part is the sort of in the process of kind of giving this various prompts and various different settings, which are largely beyond what I can do in a lifetime because there's so many parameters. I kind of can get to certain pathways in this model to learn, and then I can evaluate like its cultural value, aesthetic value, what it knows, how well it can do something. Does that make sense or no?
I'm trying. It's like, are you trying to say that abduction is a process of inference, like cultural inference?
It is the predecessor to induction and deduction. So it is like it is the anomalous thing that happens before hypotheses. So there are things that happen to us during a process of thoughts or what a lot of times abducting was literally posed as like a spatial problem. If you're in a city and you're lost, you kind of, I don't know if you've felt this, but you feel a directional pull for where you need to go. And maybe you kind of pull and you go that way. So that's the same way of like, how do you propose a hypothesis? Like how do hypotheses propose? Like what is before the hypothesis? Because this is why he proposed abduction, was that, yeah, you have deduction and you have induction, you have this process of this logical process, but nothing like mathematicians, for instance, they have to just take assumptions. And it's just like, once that assumption happens, that's everything. But what is the thing before assumption? What is the thing that solidifies or creates the assumptions? So a lot of times it's used as a heuristic function. So that's how you can optimize something by it's the process of being able to continually make hypotheses. It's the only form for Peirce that is creative, inventive, or anything. Logical or abduction or induction and deduction are not.
So
I agree with Tony. In classical epistemology, it is a lack of abduction because the characterization of theory was more complex, were too complex with the hypothetical deduction theory of theory, who is very important. But with this, we ignore completely the idea of abduction. Thank you, Tony.
Like, just to show you, like with these generative models, there's like one of the things that was sort of this is happening through this process of, they call it data intuition, whatever, is that if you just add Unreal Engine into the prompts, anywhere in the prompts, that it massively changes the quality of the image. So you with the same, you can give it one prompt, Uncanny Valley, and I can give it the second prompt, Uncanny Valley, Unreal Engine, and the massive the difference in the way that this model will generate, right, is vastly different. But I think the interesting thing is, what it gives you is it gives you intuition into the data set that was chosen. Now, obviously, they're looking at a lot of game structure, a lot of like when that's a lot of the, obviously, because the things that easily trigger through prompts or consistently trigger in patterns, right? That's its bias. So like this is like, I'm trying to explain the process of how do I direct myself in a model that is known to be generic or general, where it just learns, you feed it a bunch of data and it learns intrinsic relationships in its own language that I don't yet have. So I need to, you need to create the interface. So I'm trying to think of also an interface that's not technically bound. So like the obvious ones is like the disciplines inside of engineering that are based on explainability, that are based on like very intricate mathematical functions and regression and Gaussian, you know, and all these different things that are technically, how do I even get before that so it's accessible to common without the technical skill? And that's what's interesting, is there is a lot of, I showed you this, this is Google Colab. It's free, people share the code, and it can be like done by just like, now people are making very simple interfaces. So you're getting these conversations, which are right now anecdotal in my work, but you get conversations with these groups on Discord and Reddit, and they're basically hacking math. They don't know, they don't understand the math. There's no logical form behind it. But like, if you you just start finding things that work, they're inventing these really cool visual features without any knowledge about the mathematics. So it's a different way of approaching the model, right? That somebody could probably do it in a mathematical simulation. Like, for instance, one of the things in these visual things are, is like, how do you move the camera? So you just don't have these just static images. So they're trying to like build these visual models that can move, right? But they're using no mathematical, there are fundamental mathematical functions to camera movement in 3D space, but also like just walking and all these, but they're not dealing with any of these. They're just going in but creating a visually stimulating thing. So there's no theory. It's really hard to talk about it because there is no theory behind it, and that's the whole point of it. So when there's,
Do you
it
think
is
would
like
be right-
literally.
Do you think it would be right for me to interpret this as like generating like bias pathways, in the sense that what you're inferring from these from like from what the abductions have done and seemingly are doing is, I don't know, like
It does not make sense unless I put you in this code right now and you start to activate the code. Once you start to do it, then you understand the abduction. Otherwise, it's very weird concept. It's something before the hypothesis. Usually we start at the hypothesis. It's a, and it has the way that Magnani is talking about manipulative abduction there is a kind of like a more structured process of the different examples he can find in which this it's like collective intimacy. That's a thing that you have to you experience, and it's like abduction is not a valid thing. It's not validated. That's the thing. It creates an orientation, right?
Tony, like in the analogy that, I'm sorry for interrupting, but like the analogy that sounds so much that sounds so close to what you're talking about is really political radicalization. Like,
say more.
in the sense that it's the notion in which like all the bias pathways that you take lead you to the inferences in which it's no like in which the large scale composition is fully like within these like abductive inferences, like these like gaps. I mean, I know I don't really have any like thing interesting to say, but I just it just sounds like something like intrinsically similar to what I'm understanding what you're saying. Maybe I'm wrong. I'd be
I mean,
interested to hear what
I
other
think,
people think about it too.
yeah, let's move that to that. I mean, I think the affect is the same, but I'm not sure it's the process, but the affect is there.
Mhm.
But yeah, and it's not like I have some trouble presenting this, so apologize. I would just prefer to have some feedback or discussion, but like, it is just like, in the end, it also is like the most mundane, everyday thing we do, abduction. So when you talk about it, people, it's like, yeah, of course we do this all the time. It's an everyday reasoning, but so the purpose that Magnani is trying to look at, right, is how to kind of place this in contemporary creative theory practice.
I think in the essay, he kind of talks about, these experimental apparatuses that are involved in the abductive process, and you might see something happening in an apparatus, and you don't have an explanation for it yet, but by continued engagement with the way in which the apparatus is responding, and then starting to actually feed the apparatus certain signals and seeing how it reacts, you can form a hypothesis slowly. But before you do that, he kind of zeroes in on these kind of, they're more like attitudes than anything else, which I think speaks to the fact that this is a pre-deductive, pre-inference process, because he is talking about attitudes, like being sensitive to particular variations, or being curious, these quite attitudinal things. I think that speaks to the fact that you have no complete model, you have no information, all you have is a kind of intuition to the way an apparatus is responding to signals. And in the same way, the example you're showing, you have one prompt word that works, and you have an intuition about why it might work, but until you put another one in, you don't know if there's no until you put another one in, you can't start to build a hypothesis. I think
it's the way, that's the connection between abduction and logical deductive, which is like, it's a evaluative metric. You like, abduction is a continuous process. It's that continuous concrete that Anne-Françoise was talking about, whereas like the logical deductive process is this very slow form, this frozen. We freeze our evaluations, right? Aesthetic value changes over time. This sort of like idea of the frozen logical deductive structure mixed in with the abductive moving one, perhaps. And attitudinal for sure, like exactly what I mean by orientation. I guess like my belief, an attitude, commitment. So for it's a theoretical concept that kind of plays, I found that plays pretty well into this, the understanding of the kind of the attitude that we take for creating this sort of integrative objects, or these larger objects, right? But also deals with the relationship between the abstract and the concrete, I think, in very specific ways, right? The idea of how they kind of are tied together, right? And it's through the kind of implementation or the manipulation of such a model, right, that the connection can play, or the recursive, the relationship between two incommensurable things, like the abstract and the concrete, kind of tie into and play into it, I think. So I tried to put in integrative object abstract and see what it knows, and then I'll put integrative. But concrete will come up of it'll be too biased on the texture. But I guess, yeah. So I play playing it into this is sort of trying to think of a way of formalizing this very open experimental work that I'm doing right now, which doesn't have yet a thing to it, and just has some various anecdotal kind of Reddit, Twitter post things. I mean, it's the technology that we're using wasn't released until January this year, and then it was 4 months after that they figured out that they could use the visual way I'm showing this is actually using the models against each other in a way that isn't practical. It's an aesthetic one, but yeah, I think it's the argument is like by using this, or by thinking, at least by trying to take this position or this orientation, I might be able to come across like a different, I might be able to come through different bias pathways, like you said, and make critiques of a model that might be necessary because they're embedded in our daily life and many other ways. Like you could think about how this visual model can show you visual bias that's embedded in like text descriptions of images that are how that affects our environment, or what we see, our social information. So only way I can describe it is the best way is that it's an abductive thing. I don't know.
Joevenn, was the what you said about political radicalization, were you saying kind of like in the way that certain words or phrases can release affects, but it's not predictable which ones will, and quite surprising ones can sometimes trigger responses? Is that kind of the link you were making?
I think like what is like what Tony's doing is, I mean, the reference of abduction is really, I'm seeing it as important from really the view of it's one aspect of it, but I don't think we are really talking about it here because maybe we don't really know how to talk about it yet, but it's a question of actions without like selfhood, in a way where we are triggered to do something that seems like we are doing it of our own volition, and we still feel the volition, and yet there's this like sense of emptiness in the actions that we do.
It is okay, so to respond quickly to what you're saying, I think I'm on before it may go into something, because I know the quiet will do this, but tangent. But like what, like man. So like I think you're okay. No, I'm sorry.
Can I jump in on that comment?
Please.
One of the things that's come up for me throughout like both Tony and Anne's talk about this is that there's a lot of sort of language around movement. And I feel like in terms of like an epistemic mediator, it feels like, to go back to your talk last week, Joevenn, that like there's like a sort of like the body itself as being like a primary like epistemic mediator in terms of it just moving in space. And I'm also coming at this from somebody who works mainly in contemporary dance. So, but just like to have these like sort of abductive, intuitive things that just happen because you are a body in space. And then there's also something about separating one's selfhood from that body. Weirdly, I think to kind of touch on that, I'm not sure exactly how to phrase it, but
Yeah.
it seems like there's something there.
There is also, there's something between the abductive quality of thing, which is very individualistic, about like embodied, oriented, and the collective, sort of the collective relationship, or the environment. The abduction talks about abduction is about, this what Joevenn was talking about with the idea of like, for I guess free will and a space where you're abducted by something. That's the ecological sort of environmental aspect, right? Is that what you're talking about is the sort of the structure of the environment, sort of. If we could think of that as like what sort of abductions occur when we kind of construct a generic space and we kind of experiment on the generic space, because the environmental structure in which the environment that we construct, the future that we construct, right, which is spatial as well in our thing, is the kind of one of the things that's like sort of like our free active, our choices are made in like that more of a collective construction rather than like my individual choices, maybe.
I think there's also a way of like, if you think about like the unconscious and arguments about how whether the unconscious is structured like language, or whether it's something that extends beyond the individual into like a collective unconscious or a machinic unconscious. I feel there's an interesting thing about how like abduction can be used to explore could be used to explore the structure of the unconscious, in the sense that you're just picking up signals of what is being reacted to, that allows you to create a kind of map, or a map of the unconscious, if you like.
Like a black box theory.
Yeah. But there'd be no other way to explore the unconscious, positively speaking, although there are people that think that. But
it's the same. Yeah, I mean, at that way, that's the limit. That's the last instance, right? Before the last instance, the real, right? And that's sort of a almost black box interaction if you think about it at the surface. You kind of, that's how you can never touch the real, but you can act and kind of orient and adjust and create. So yes, I agree. Bryn says abduction might be seen as continuous pathways of movement that is prior to choice, and I think that's a good point to make as well. I think like the things that we're discussing are about like are kind of like how to kind of construct it, because now now just pose the question to construct a model about like in this way, right? Is of pandemic, right? But each model needs to make specific choices, because a model can't, if a model if it's supposed to tell you everything, it's kind of a useless model. Models are very partial and particular. So I think it's a lot about how one orients before the work is made, I guess, which might have been better if I came earlier in the course, but apologies. But like what we'll talk about in the next two sessions will make a lot of sense, I think, which will be like how artists are really taking this and making aesthetic objects. I'm not technically making aesthetic objects, I'm sort of evaluating them as aesthetic objects. But.
Yeah, me bringing in the question of acting without like self, I mean, just simply because like, I mean, abduction, you know, like alien abduction, political abduction. There's an action that's going on like without your will, like without your choice. And the strange thing is that you still experience it because you're still, you know, the person going through the abduction. And that was why I was like bringing it in with regards to the question of like selfhood, which is, you know, another topic of thought altogether. But yeah.
Mhm. So I think the way that like one way that we can like think of like this vectorization talk of like how fiction is a vector, right? We can think of it also in this spatial sort of this orienting spatial way, right? And the way that the vector space model even works is, you know, by so that's like a way of using that. So when we speak of the vector philosophy as a vector, or fiction is a vector, right? We're taking the mathematical theory of vector space, and we're using that as a model, right, to discuss the fiction, right, which is something that has force, but also is pointing towards an external object, which is like that the structure of fiction, of fiction. So that like it gives you this sort of spatial visual understanding of the concept, I guess, if that makes sense. Because we do say fiction is a vector. We say fiction is a vector. We say future is an operator. But they're not, these aren't metaphors. They're models. It's kind of sort of like it is the tension of Tetralogos, if you've read Tetralogos or know of it, right? Is that Laro is not a musician. We know this. He's not a musician, but doesn't mean that he can't compose. He can't be musical. That the music can't be used as the external model to sort of reorient his position in philosophy, right? Because he's not going to make music. It won't sound. It won't be sonic. It's going to still end up being philosophy at the end of it. But it brings them to new terms, like, and using counterpoint, for instance, right? That's slightly distinct from the way that you can metaphorically or analogously use it. So for me, this generative algorithm that's culture object right now, right? Shared, this model itself, which has been trained and pre-trained and kind of shared, is like acts as an epistemic an aesthetic object to be accessed to kind of experiment. That's sort of how I'm trying to experiment with it, right? And it has good citation, yes. But it's not the model itself it's like that. In that sense, there's sort of like a meta model. There's an integrative object that I'm constructing, like with the model as my concrete kind of manipulation. I'm kind of constructing a model, right? That's trying to think of how these things have agency or will have age, thinking about the near future of how they'll embed themselves in a culture, what kind of effects will happen. Any other comments? We do the matrix. Did we do the matrix or attempt it, both of you? Do you want to discuss, shall we discuss the matrix, which will be our, yeah, I would like to do that, and we have, give it a good amount of time. So does either one of you want to volunteer first?
Do you
Yeah.
want to go again, since I think I went first last time?
Yeah, let's do that. Brendan.
Parity.
Yeah, sure. I'm just looking at your work now, Zane. I'm like, I guess I didn't really put it into a
It's okay if you didn't do it in the form.
straightforward matrix. But I was kind of just after like rereading the fiction that you wrote last week and trying to sort of synthesize it a little bit on some points. Specifically, I was thinking about this sort of like absence, presence of the world that you were talking to or talking about. So I was kind of looking at that in relation to a sort of like planetary model, which I was working with, specifically using a sort of piece from Derrida's White Mythology, which was about like the sun as being like an absent present thing. So I don't know, should I just read it or?
Any way that you're most comfortable with you talking about it is fine with me. I mean, is it a readable thing? Then
Yeah,
just...
it's a readable thing. It's I just did like a straightforward sort of like picking up on things that Zane was sort of writing about last class and sort of responding to that, as opposed to making like a more of a matrix specifically.
Yeah, it's just not in its visual diagrammatic form, right? But
yeah. So I don't know, it's kind of long as well. I'm kind of like it's okay, but I'm basically trying to look at what like sort of absence and presence means in terms of like a more sort of like quote unquote universal field, in terms of like the sun in fact not being absent or you know present in opposition to absence. Oh yeah, can I screen share?
Yes,
Okay,
please.
Here we go. So yeah, the quote I guess is from White Mythology is the sensory in general does not limit knowledge for reasons that are intrinsic to the form of the presence of the sensory thing. But first of all, because the estheton cannot always not present itself, can hide itself, absent itself. It does not yield itself upon command, and its presence is not to be mastered. Now, from this point of view, the sun is the sensory object par excellence. It is the paradigm of the sensory and of metaphor. It regularly turns itself and hides itself. As the metaphoric trope always implies a sensory kernel, or rather something like the sensory, which can always not be present, then the turning of the sun always will have been the trajectory of metaphor. Thus, metaphor means heliotrope, both a movement turned toward the sun and the turning movement of the sun. The very opposition of appearing and disappearing, the entire lexicon of the phanesthai or aletheia, of day and night, of the visible and the invisible, of the present and the absent. All this is possible only under the sun. And so using that sort of as a jumping off point, because I just felt like that like way of placing a sort of like absence and presence is very situated in a specific way, and trying to look at it in a sort of more quote unquote like universal field. as the sun is something that doesn't disappear just because one can't see it. To yeah, and trying to like extend that into a vector field, I guess. Like something that is never hidden, but something that one moves towards. Yeah.
Even in the sense as how it changed the trajectory of how you were approaching your original problem is interesting. I mean, like that's in itself like but like yeah, it's an interesting tension with his what it's always a towards, it's a thing coming, it's always an object coming at you, or is that the double of the movement, which is kind of like the dual of the vector?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, like, I guess towards can also be thought of in terms of like a positive or negative movement. I don't know that it's like it's a movement in relation to the thing, whether it's away from or towards. And I don't know, it feels like this is something that I want to sort of expand on with the previous fiction in order to like think through the sort of proposition of this specific sort of weird planet that originally.
Yeah, because you have this now, this expansion of the without inside or outside. Now you have without the inside or the outside, how are you going to know if it's towards or away from?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know yet.
So
something really well with I only like I'd seen a Klein, is it a Klein jar or Klein bottle?
Klein form.
Yeah, so I'd seen that before, but I'd never really thought about it in any detail. But then understood that it was a similar kind of geometric entity to like the Mobius strip, and that's one of its features is that it doesn't have like a fixed point of reference. So if you can be going, you're not going left or right or up or down at any point, you're just traversing it kind of. And I think, the text that you've just shown us, the matrix, really takes that idea and applies it to that kind of like turning away from, turning towards, especially with the idea of a sun that, like isn't, that is all, that is kind of the unifying referent for everything that sits under it. Like, so I thought that was very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, now it'll be interesting to construct the house at the edge of this story here. Construct a home for your fiction.
For sure. I think that there's something interesting about movement in terms of like no fixed point of reference. It's like the paradox of the Klein bottle and the Mobius strip is that they're just like non-orientable, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's no direction, but that if you keep traversing, you will end up facing oneself. Like there's like a weird paradox at work there.
Yeah, I think you came across a very, I hope you do continue to kind of advance it, because it's very interesting.
Thanks.
And I think it does have, even though you're not like making an academic direct response like Bob, like putting yours in context with his, but that goes back and problematizes the Zane's point of view of like being close to, right? So also a problem. So now rethinking like Nietzsche's position or the exit position, exiting is actually potentially coming close in the way that he wanted to say, like, which was the in a way, the paradoxical way that he's positioning himself, right, is no longer a paradox in your world. It just is right.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that Zane's piece last week also brought up. This, like, the turning away is like the coming towards as well.
Yeah, the getting close by escaping was the kind of idea, right? The you get out of, but without an inside and outside, you're kind of, all the 20th century examples kind of become problematic, and you need to kind of then reground yourself, reform yourself. And that's exactly what you did by providing this, skeleton of the model, of the Kleinian model, and like then using the idea of movement from what, this is good. It's perfect. I mean, this is better than anything, like what I like better. I much appreciate this. Is really good.
Thank you. Does Zane want to share his work as well?
Yeah, I can show mine. I did stick to the table, which probably
You could just, no, that's good. The
yeah,
table is fun.
Yeah. I'll share it now. Can you see that okay?
Mhm.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, so I stick quite closely to the matrix, but have was kind of reading both back and forth and kind of picked out, I guess, headings that I guess they're thematic in a way, but also were kind of about starting points for approaches in each. So one of them was, this idea of like, what is the experiment in each fiction? And I think the experiment that I saw in my fiction is, unilaterality and solitude as two kind of experiments with the ideas of distance or the ideas of relation. Like one, takes an object and removes any relations to it. It kind of gets rid of the idea of distance relation altogether. And then the other actually does a similar thing, but in a slightly different way. And the experiment that I saw in Bryn's kind of fiction was, this idea of an object with a single surface, with no interior, exterior, binary. And I kind of, in the fiction, it felt like it was stretching that idea kind of to a limit. And then what's the kind of force at play in both? So I think in Bryn's fiction, it's the idealized experimental diagram made into a generative force, like it's an object of speculation, and there's that kind of planetary aspect that comes from it. Whereas in my fiction, I think it's exploring the idea of the world as a generative force. So, like in philosophy, like in the history of philosophy, the idea of creation and its relation to like a kind of instantaneous connection with the world and that sort of idea. And then space, the idea of space at play in each fiction. So in mine, it's that spatial kind of metaphor of turning towards or away, which obviously came out in Bryn's Matrix. And then this also came out in our discussion, but in Bryn's, it's the experiment of a single surface, like the negation of orientability of like not being able to orientate yourself. That's kind of like the spatial logic of that fiction. What's the reality that each fiction is working with? I think in Bryn, the reality is kind of constructed. It's the reality is speculated from a particular cause, or is driven by the object, and that's where the reality comes from. It gains its sense from that Klein bottle. And in my fiction, like reality is kind of the impossible object of philosophy, and that kind of turning towards is part of that. That notion of the reality as an impossible object, something that you can't engage with directly, but is nonetheless kind of driving everything. And then the notion of bodies, or I suppose I could have said entities, which I think in mine I kind of taken as given, and I suppose either relational or unilateral. And in Bryn's, that that Klein-Bossel it's a body reduced to a singular dimension. But I guess what I haven't written here, which I could have written, is that it's also that one quality or one property of the bottle is then generative of many others. Yeah. And I guess what I haven't done is kind of like synthesize those two rows on the matrix into a new narrative. But I think by working through the columns, you do start to see some interesting, like.
That's exactly the point. I think the point is not to make the interpretation, but to provide the, like, you're not being the what I was saying, you're being the provider of information rather than, but like, because it is in the act of like traversing the matrix that you get the multiple perspectives. Like they all exist right now. As the object of the matrix, like the multiple perspectives exist in tension, and that's sort of like the point of the exercise. And I think that there's because now this, what I'll do is I will take this and I'll take Bryn's and superposition them on the original one. So we'll have a larger matrix, maybe with some overlaps, with some without. And I think I'll try to pull out some. I think we can maybe spend the last 10 minutes just thinking about like what we think the common threads, like what are the common concepts, like if we want to consider it to be, if we want to consider, like we know that here one common concept is movement, right? Whether movement is positional, like an exit, whether it's Euclidean, like a simple vector, or whether it's like your vector, Bryn, which is the non-Euclidean space, the free vectors, right? They have no origin point. So I think like movement, I think movement orientation, because orientation I think is kind of brings up like mine, which is like does directional matters both with initial conditions and without, right? So if you don't know where you're going, right, perhaps I think that changes things. Let's think, and I think then like then we have to like we turn back and we think about like what we like, we're fluidly moving between concrete movements and abstract movements, right? And like whether, like I guess one of the questions I bring from what I was talking about earlier is whether or not that like that concrete practices or concrete manipulations, what they add to this sort of practice. Like, is it just a question, but is it better to have Zane present the tool or to present an interpretation of the tool, I guess is like the question, the matrix. And I think now like and I'm just thinking about like what, so if that's what I want to do is I'll synthesize what you've already worked on here and present it back to you, and what I think we should work on with with the both of you, right, is, well, I think if, let's do this, so Bryn, what I'd like you to do is, if you can, think about the form of the hypothesis and the situation of your fiction. Take a hypothesis in a meta form, right? And use that to kind of direct where you go with how this fiction works. So if you want to take the hypothesis, right, that the way that if like the hypothesis that it's like you're literally a vector or something, I don't know, like what it may be. Think about this in this sense and see if we can and see if you can produce a third. And Zane, like, because I will be doing the work to synthesize, what I want to think about for you is well, do you have any ideas of where you want to go with this first, or would you like to, do you want to continue on from where you're going, or you want to take on something new?
I think, I guess I'm not sure yet. I think it's probably some interesting.
I have some weird questions for you, but I don't know if they're going to completely connect. But like, okay, for instance, I was reading about construal methods. So like the idea of how climate is how people relate to climate change based on if it's an abstract image distant, if it's an abstract image close, if it's a concrete image that's close, or the concrete image that's far away. What they found out, ironically, or I guess contradictory, what you normally would think, is that actually people had no change to their original position, but if it was an abstract distant concept, they changed their orientation on how they relate to the thing. So the problematic is how to make the remote concrete. And I think that deals a little bit with your exit strategy, your exit or exit or towards, maybe I don't know. I'm just thinking that's one example of where I would go, but you can do any kind of play in this sense.
Yeah,
but I think
properly reading Bryn's Matrix will probably give me some ideas as well. But yeah, I think I'm sure.
Because this one is more open, would you prefer to have like a check-in with us like halfway through quickly, like an email exchange or anything, or like just to see how you're doing, or do you feel like this is okay for you to kind of produce something and come back with it?
I would find email useful, if only as a kind of like accountability thing, to make sure I'm doing stuff during the week. Yeah.
Okay. So let's do when I'll email. What is are you in London? I can't tell. You're in the UK somewhere, maybe because your accent, but
yeah, no, I'm in London. Yep.
Okay. So let's say you're working, so I'll send you an email by your like maybe sometime around dinner time, so you can look at it just briefly after, and then we'll just to make sure that we're not leaving you out to dry and you don't feel. I just want to make sure. And Bryn, I'll just send you an email as well Wednesday, and just to check in, and maybe there are more ideas to be shared.
Great, thank you.
Because like the next course will be heavily workshop based. I think she'll present a lot of her work, but I think she likes to work a lot and workshop based. And then we're going to want to start to do some more like the next two sessions, we're going to start to do some more sort of thinking about how these things will be put together. And I don't know if we told you last time, Zane, but we would like to collect what we have done throughout these weeks and have this sort of collective publication in some sense. So we're going to just start to discuss, the next course will take at least 10 minutes, 15 minutes to discuss like what kind of formats we want to do. I mean, like how we want to present it. and things like that. We want to like, yeah, so we actually have some kind of productive aspect of this. I think that's it for me, but Joevenn?